Hi, my name is Joel Thame, and over spring break, we had to read Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith. I'm so bad at names. Don't ever ask me to do this for anyone ever again. I'm gonna bring you through this video, talking about interesting points that I found throughout the book and things that really had me thinking about other minds. Especially minds within marine mammals, just maybe other minds in general, not just human minds. I will say I think Godfrey Smith did make very compelling arguments throughout this book for other minds. I am more able to assess whether or not I'm more open to the idea of things other than humans having some form of consciousness now because of him, which I think is something that Marr kind of missed the mark on a little bit. I don't know, the way it's presented in this book makes it seem a lot more plausible and more convincing, but I'm gonna take you through everything that I took away from the book, and yeah. So one interesting argument that was made in the first chapter, well, I don't even know if it's an argument because it's kind of like biological fact, but we are all connected to a common ancestor, and there is a common ancestor that exists between octopuses and humans, and from that divergence, it is possible that, well, it is possible, not possible, it did happen, a completely different evolution of a nervous system can exist. I think this is extremely plausible, and the way I can think about it is less away from the evolution side and more towards just like human development. For example, me and my best friend from high school, we obviously went our separate ways when I left for college and she stayed at home to work at her family's restaurant. Regardless of this divergence between the two of us, we were still able to grow and develop, go through similar experiences, learn how to handle them, all of these things. And just because we're not in the same environment doesn't necessarily mean we can't grow and evolve and become not the same person, because no two people are ever the same, but it's not impossible. I think trying to view the possibility of other kinds of minds existing through this lens is so pivotal, because yeah, my mind is different from my other friends' minds, but then again, you could make that same argument for an animal that went through different evolutions to have their own form of a mind. And I think that's really intriguing to think about, and I think it does open the door for a lot more possibility for what we do consider to have a mind. Smith also talked about how octopuses seem to like coexist in like some complicated state where they're like not friends nor enemies with each other, they just kind of are. And I think that's so characteristic of the human experience, except we do have our friends and we do have our enemies. But I guess in the grand scheme of how humans act with other humans, we aren't really friends nor enemies, we just coexist at the end of the day. I guess our friends or enemies are what we make in our mind, and I guess you could argue maybe an octopus would have a friend or an enemy based on how they've perceived their fellow octopus inhabitants that they coexist with. Like, I don't know. But yeah, regardless, I think it's a very intriguing argument, and yeah. Moving into chapter 2, something that I found so interesting was Godfrey Smith's interpretation of talking about prokaryotes and how they evolved into eukaryotes, and how prokaryotes have some sense of perception. I'm gonna point out something that he said. He says that in order for an organism to do this, as in detect what's going on around them, One part of it must be receptive, in which case it must be able to smell or hear, and the other part must be active, which is able to make something useful happen. Now, do I think this is a form of mind? Not necessarily. This could just be a biochemical response to some form of stimulus, and I kind of don't want to automatically assume this is biochemical, because you could argue that anything within the human experience is biochemical. There's neural mechanisms that constitute every emotion that you've ever had, according to the most reductive neuroscientist. Your heart beats from biochemical responses. Stress is mainly driven physiologically. Like, there's so many things that are like the foundations of the human experience that are just solely dictated by biochemical processes, and I don't think it would be fair for me to use that argument anymore that this is just a simple biochemical process. So when I remove that away from everything, mind, like, the possibility of other things having minds becomes a lot more plausible. I did want to take a minute and talk about the evolution of eukaryotes, though, because in this chapter it's kind of talked about how prokaryotes were like able to have like a mind of their own through like studies with E. coli bacterium, and how a lot of single-celled organisms are able to use solar power as a source of energy rather than like communication and light, where a lot of single-celled eukaryotes and multicellular eukaryotes can use light not just for energy but also for more productive things like sensing. I do find it intriguing though that these prokaryotes evolved into eukaryotes by one prokaryote swallowing the other, and if we are able to constitute a mind as something that has an ability to sense and an ability to elicit some productive response that a single-celled prokaryote can do, when multiple prokaryotes come together and make one organism, it almost gives like this panpsychism kind of view where everything within an organism has a mind of its own and it works in tandem for the entire being. And I mean, it sounds like, again, it just sounds plausible. Like, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the more we evolve, the more complex these interactions become, and the more distinct some form of a mind is. So I think it is super interesting that we're talking about it in this way. And I think Godfrey Smith might be onto something when he talks about that. I'm not saying the panpsychist view is probably the best view we should use when we're talking about whether or not other organisms have minds of their own, but I think it does raise a lot of interesting questions when it comes to understanding what a mind really is. Moving on to chapter 3, the most interesting part about this chapter was learning the differences between the evolution of two distinct nervous systems and comparing the chordate nervous system, which we have, as well as many other mammals, vertebrates, fish, birds, with the brain and then the spinal cord that runs down like the center of the organism, and that brain at the top focuses, like, is where all like the cognition, all the sensing, like the sensory motor area, if you will, of the entire organism is here. Every biochemical process within the organism is dictated by the brain, and the spinal cord is used to direct signals from this nervous system to the rest of the body. And this contrasts from octopuses and other cephalopods, where they use a ladder-like system with ganglia distributed evenly throughout the body. There was a little bit of a discourse in this chapter with Smith, talking about how each arm of an octopus kind of has a mind, like appears to have a mind of its own. And I thought that was really interesting. And when I think about like octopuses in water versus humans in water, I feel like for example, like a human, when you're swimming in water, it's very much like your head is like what is driving you forward. You could argue that that is just the way like a human is anatomically like able to. But it seems like they lead with their head, and in contrast, octopuses are able to lead with like a more distributed sense of movement. Like there's not really one focal part of an octopus that is propelled forward. Every part of it can like move freely and evenly and can lead the organism in any which way it desires. So I wrote a lovely little haiku because thinking about the ganglia within an octopus can raise a question of whether or not each like concentration of ganglia within the organism can be a mind of its own. And I really want to stay away from talking about it like that because I feel like it's dangerous or like jeopardizing the entire world of neuroscience when we say an octopus or any organism for that matter can have multiple brains. And I don't really think that's what's happening here, because whereas with a human brain, everything is concentrated in one area, but with an octopus and other cephalopods, it's just distributed. Yeah, I don't know, but like the way they move it like can seem like that. So I wrote a little haiku that I will share with the class. Brains, neurons, systems, how do these things constitute a mind of their own? And I guess that's what we're gonna attempt to answer through the rest of this book. Moving on. In chapter 4, a fun little conversation that was had has to do with the evolution of experience and focusing more so on sentience rather than consciousness and making the distinction between the two. I think that's very important when it comes to understanding other minds. Godfrey Smith kind of hints at saying whether or not octopuses are conscious might be asking too much of the octopus and what it's able to do. And by us saying that something can't be conscious would be the argument that it's not able to have a mind, which isn't necessarily an accurate statement, because we know all animals like have some sense of a mind, like they're able to perceive their environment and act accordingly. Goal-directed action, all these things. And there's just a lot of signs that point into the direction of animal minds existing. And an interesting conversation that Godfrey Smith goes through in this chapter has to do with understanding the like sensory motor arc versus the motor to sensory arc and how they're not necessarily like synced up. We can use the senses that we perceive from our external environment and turn them on their head to elicit some kind of action or behavior based on what we've perceived. But also at the same time, we can use our motor systems to interact with the environment to gather what we want to sense. So for example, I could use my motor systems to go on YouTube and watch a video. And by like my body physically going to do that, I'm able to process and sense what I want to. It's kind of interesting though, because the conversation's brought up where you might not necessarily have full control of your motor to sensory arc, whereas with your sensory to motor arc, you kind of can, depending on what kind of action or behavior you're eliciting and whether or not it's voluntary or involuntary. But it's kind of interesting that that motory to sensory arc isn't as controlled by the agent as the opposing one is. And kind of understanding how an environment can be manipulated and how that can affect a mind is kind of crazy. It kind of reminds me of arguments in enactivism where the mind can be understood as our interactions with our direct environment. And I guess this might be like an activist field day actually, because being able to manipulate an environment and measuring changes within cognition and changes within the sensory systems and sensory inputs and outputs is kind of like crucial to understanding how a mind can work. And by manipulating an environment, it opens up this world of possibilities for understanding the mind not just as an agent's ability to act on its world, but the world's ability to act on an agent. And I think that's super interesting. Moving on to chapter 5, by far, I think this might be the most interesting chapter to me. I found it really fun of Godfrey Smith to be talking about how octopuses are able to camouflage and change the color of their skin, yet they only have one kind of photoreceptor, which leads us to believe that they are colorblind. And the conversations about how the species possesses the chromatophores to adapt to their environment, but can't really process what colors are present in its environment. It's kind of interesting, and it kind of jeopardizes how we view perception, because you would think the act of camouflage is perceiving the colors around you and eliciting a behavioral response in changing to fit them. But if the organism itself doesn't have the neural ability to process or perceive the colors around them, how's it able to engage in this complex behavior? However, it was interesting to see that maybe different parts of an octopus are able to process and perceive all the colors that help it camouflage, but those perceptions are kept within that specific part of the organism, so the organism as a whole can't necessarily understand what's going on. It kind of ties back into chapter 3 with the ladder-like neural structure, neural architecture, if you will, of an octopus, where it has all the ganglia based in different parts of the body, and this like distributed nervous system has a way of having like a mind of its own, which I know I did not want to say that, but it's kind of shifting in that direction. Know when I'm saying that though, I don't mean it like explicitly. I think it's important that we could use that as an analogy, but not to take it as anything more important than that. And I think if you actually like sit down and look at a video of an octopus actively going through camouflage, you can see that the whole organism itself doesn't really do it all at once. It's like parts of the organism. Like as octopus like might go from like somewhere dark to somewhere light, it's kind of like a gradient. Like as the body like enters that space, like you see like each individual part of the octopus change color. And I think that is so intriguing in the sense of how the neural system of a octopus is engineered, that it's able to do that, and that's not necessarily something that humans are able to do. I think where we go from here is understanding how these individual perceptions from different parts of the octopus's body help contribute to the overall perception of the organism as a whole. And how can the octopus understand and perceive color with the only photochemical receptor that it has being one, which is subjective of only color blindness, because you can't really have color vision without at least 2 photoreceptors, and only possessing one doesn't really allow for a distinction between colors, more so just lights and darks. And there was like a little conversation about like maybe they can like understand hues in this terms of like this like black and white colorblind vision. I don't really think that captures the full picture of like how octopuses are able to adapt and see color within their environment. I like the analogy from the orchid expert, I'm blanking on his name, but something about how the chromatophores work with these like photoreceptors like embedded in the skin, and they are able to create the picture for the octopus to understand. So maybe necessarily they don't need, the organism as a whole doesn't need to understand the color around them, but these like interactions between the chromatophores and the photoreceptors within the skin help create the picture for the whole organism to understand. It's kind of like putting a puzzle piece together. The only like analogy I can really think of is a bunch of detectives trying to solve like a cold case, and you weren't explicitly there, you don't explicitly know what happened, but you can take all this evidence and all of these things to try to create a picture of what is going on in your environment. And I think octopuses probably operate on a very similar mechanism. And I think that's really interesting because it's so different from how humans perceive color and how other animals perceive color. And it really just goes to show how, yes, like these nervous systems are so distinct in their evolutionary patterns, and with that distinction is like the different modes of neural engineering and neural architecture that we as humans don't really attempt to acknowledge because we're always so used to our minds and like how our minds operate and how we can equate our understanding of our own nervous system to others, and how we use all these animal models to help explain our own neural architecture and our own understanding of how the brain works. It like raises concerns because these nervous systems are so distinct from each other within not just their function but how they evolved, and understanding how there could be such a diversity in how a brain works kind of makes me wonder if relying on animal models to help us explain human neuronal function is plausible. And yes, animal models have worked for us in the past, and I think it is like truly fascinating. We've learned a lot from them, but in terms of fully explaining the functionality of the human experience through neural mechanisms based on animal models doesn't really capture the whole picture, and I think we might need to start looking at something that might. And I think discussing octopus minds and how they perceive vision is just one example about how a nervous system can be so different by its foundation and yield such a different kind of functionality based on these two very distinct lineages of evolution. However, when we use rat models to explain human perception, it kind of makes me wonder, well, how are rat minds different from human minds? How have we evolved? How have our nervous systems evolved so differently that they have such different functions compared to rat models? And how do we know that the functionality of a rat model is equal to the functionality of the human mind? We don't know. Chapter 6 definitely explores the world of consciousness and how it has come to be and how it is so distinct within the human experience. Because, for example, I could be sitting in a lecture absorbing content, but everyone's going to absorb that differently based on their own subjective experience. And for example, I'm in an epistemology class, and when we're talking about gaslighting, for example, there are people in there that are taking that very critically and like actually like taking in the theory and being like, oh, this is really intriguing. Like this is like the epistemic foundations of a type of behavior. In my head, I'm immediately applying gaslighting to like every single situation I've ever encountered in my life where I feel like I have been gaslit. And that's just where we're different. That's just based on my own subjective experience. And I think it's kind of interesting to say that octopuses and other kinds of organisms are able to have that kind of ability. I would say like it's like a higher order kind of thought process to have a consciousness. My personal belief is that consciousness comes to be because we as humans receive so much stimulus from so many different sources every single second of every single day of our lives. And we tend to only be attentive to the ones that matter to us, and what makes them matter, I guess, is what we focus our attention to. And more like conversations about attention could probably like help us understand why specific stimuli drive us to do things, or why we focus specifically on little things other than like big pictures and stuff like that. To me, consciousness is also kind of linked to this inner voice in our head that we have like an ability to converse with ourselves and think about things like we're talking to somebody else, but it's just us like talking within our inner self. And I also find it very intriguing that even in like a room with 4 white walls and nothing else going on, like your inner imagination, your inner mind can be so distinct and so different. And there are people that have an ability to like be okay in a room with 4 white walls and nothing else. Me personally, no. No. But yeah. I don't think we can really say octopuses have some sense of consciousness. I don't know why I would assume that. I want to say it's because it's like a higher order of thought. And since we have like all of our brain power centralized in one focal point in the mind, the brain is able to form synapses and go through neuroplasticity and network itself in such a way that it's able to have an ability to process all these higher order thoughts and store them and have us, like, allow us to have an imagination based on all of these other sensory inputs that we're not necessarily consciously aware of, but we can become consciously aware of them through our subjective experiences and reflections within our inner mind. And I don't know necessarily if octopuses possess the neural architecture to have some form of consciousness. I think we've established throughout this book that they are able to at least have some form of sentience, which to me, I feel like if an agent is able to be sentient, then it's able to have a mind of its own. If it's able to engage with its environment in a way that's meaningful for them, to me that's enough to constitute mindedness. But I don't think an octopus is able to sit there and be like, why do I feel this way? I don't think octopuses really have an emotion. I think they're able to perceive pain and like stuff like that. That was highlighted in chapter 4. But in terms of like these subjective experiences, and I'm saying subjective experiences lightly because pain is a subjective experience, and I think not all octopuses would feel pain the same way, but these like higher level subjective experiences like emotions, thoughts, ruminating, pining, yearning, all these things I don't think octopuses are doing. I don't think they possess the ability to do such, but I don't think because they're not able to have some form of consciousness in that way doesn't mean that they don't have a mind. I think they still do have a mind, and I think it's very evident that they do based on how they interact with each other, how they interact with themselves, how they interact with their environment. And yeah, I think I am an octopus mind fan. I support this one. Plant minds might have been crazy, but definitely I think octopuses definitely possess a mind of some sort. I'm not gonna lie, chapter 7 definitely had me on the borderline of some existential crisis. I don't know. Thinking about death makes me tweak out. I don't know why, but definitely this chapter was a mindfuck, to say the least. Yeah, this chapter kind of talks about the paradox between like cephalopod intelligence and how intelligent they are. They tend to have like a relatively brief lifespan, and it kind of starts begging the question about how like any organism is able to die because cells have an ability to replicate and reproduce, and they're constantly replacing each other. And there was often like a theory of comparing an organism to a car, where a car will eventually wear out over time and will like lose its function, and it was often thought that organisms operate in the same way. But with this constant cell replication and replacement, these parts are never really wearing out, and it kind of opens up a new conversation about whether or not, it starts, it makes you wonder, like, why do things die if their machinery is being constantly replaced? And there were two very interesting theories that were brought up in this chapter. The Madauer effect essentially says that like most organisms, like natural selection as a whole, doesn't really have as strong of an effect on an older organism as a younger organism, because natural selection is kind of about helping the organism adapt to predation or adapting to disease, and like how the organism can overcome that. But once the organism has reached like an old, like has aged and like reached that point, natural selection kind of like goes out the window because not many organisms have made it to that point. And looking at it through that perspective, it makes me wonder if natural selection could continue in a way that the organism can age out, and like these mutations that like result in programmed death of an organism can be modified through natural selection so that the organism can extend its lifetime, possibly infinitely, who knows. I think it's really interesting though, because I feel like with natural selection, I don't think organisms ever reach that point where they're able to extend their lifetime through natural selection in terms of the evolutionary sense, because rather than one organism just perfecting itself time and time and time again, we just get the birth of a new organism and its ancestor eventually dies off. Like we've seen that with humans and how we went from like the Neanderthals to the Homo sapiens, and like our recent ancestors don't really exist anymore. They're extinct, and it's interesting. Is there a way that an environment for one organism can be sustained for so long that natural selection can play out long enough to extend the expected life of the organism? I think this is a really interesting conversation that scientists should be looking into, because me personally, I really don't want to die, ever. Like, the thought of dying like makes me want to crash out. So if there's like a way that science can explain how the human experience can be essentially like eternally expanded, that would be like groundbreaking. Obviously would be an understatement. But yeah, it opens the door for a lot of questions about what is life, what life can be, and what would that mean for the conscious experience if we remove the restraints of inevitable death, and like what that could mean for society, let alone an organism. The other theory that was brought up in the reading is the Williams effect, where these genes that we have could bring us success at first, but they ultimately lead to some form of a downfall later in our life, and it's kind of like a trade-off. I believe the example that was used in the book was, for example, in humans, our genes are programmed for us to have like reproductive success like early in our life, like when we reach puberty. We are equipped with the ability to bear children, or if you're a man, give woman children. I don't know, man, but it's interesting because with that, there's like the trade-off that you are like rapidly aging. And it's kind of interesting to think about aging in the sense of trade-offs with things that help the organism at the moment. It makes me wonder how we can mitigate these trade-offs so like humans can have it all, because at the end of the day, like humans are very selfish and they want everything they want. Me as a human, I can say that. But it makes me wonder, like, is there a way through science and technology and this like emergence of these kinds of theories, is there a way that we can modify the body to accommodate for these trade-offs, but not in a way that it could like age us in a bad way, but like, I don't know, we can have it all. And like, sure, like we might be able to have reproductive success at a young age, but that doesn't necessarily mean like we are going to be dying off anytime soon. And I mean, like, I guess that's very true with the human experience, because like you reach puberty at like what, 9, 10, 11, 12, a very early adolescence, if you will, but you go on to live like 60, 70, 80, over 100 years, if you're that equipped, if you have that blessed of genes. But I don't know, this whole chapter kind of like introduced me to like this whole idea of like biomodification, and like with these theories, have they ever been applied to attempt to expand human life expectancy? And if not, how could we go about doing that? And I think science should do that in my best interest, because I do not want to die anytime soon. Yeah, I don't know. This chapter really got me good. This chapter got me good. a lot of things I read don't really make me, I don't know, a lot of things I read don't elicit very strong emotions out of me. This did, I don't know why. Okay, scratch everything I said about color vision in chapter 5, because Octopolis, I want to go there. This has to be like the most intriguing thing I've read out of this entire book. The fact that octopuses exhibit such a social behavior that to us we kind of like don't really understand what it could be. They tend to like hit each other with their tentacles essentially, and we don't really know if that's like an aggressive thing, if it's like a social way of communication. But regardless of whether or not it's like a positive or negative interaction between octopuses, it's safe to say that it's some form of communication which exhibits some form of intelligence within the animal. And it's kind of interesting because in the past, like, we've kind of viewed octopuses as these like asocial creatures, and like they really don't have like a way of understanding like each other, like they don't really communicate and stuff like that. But through like these interactions and behaviors that were observed in Octopolis, like the Nosferatu pose, that's actually like freaky. I think if I saw that in person, I'd like probably poop my pants. Yeah, it highlights like a flexibility in environment and how that could really shape an organism's intelligence, because these octopuses have evolved their intelligence in such a way that like they're intelligent on their like by themselves, but also in the context of other organisms within a constantly changing environment rather than a stable community. They're able to still communicate with each other, and there's these like landmark behaviors that they exhibit, and like it seems like the other octopuses are able to understand what they mean and like they react appropriately. And I think this kind of raises the question of like how much like an environment really can play a role in terms of shaping a mind and like the behaviors one can elicit. And I think it's super interesting, and it kind of like ties me back into like issues with epistemology, where we don't really understand how the minds of others work if we isolate ourselves, and we are not just this like sole thinker who's absorbing knowledge. Rather, we learn better from communities and other people and their perceptions and their perspectives, and piecing it all together to form our own sense of knowledge. And I think that's super important when it comes to assessing the intelligence of an octopus, because we see like they are very like intelligent on their own through the way they're able to camouflage and all these other behaviors that they are able to elicit. But this like sociality of them in the context of other organisms helps us understand how their behavior seems more intelligent and more intentional in the context of other like species. And it's super interesting to think about. But yeah, overall, this book was super interesting, minus like the little existential crisis I might have had during chapter 7. I really did enjoy this reading. I think Godfrey Smith did a really, really good job at trying to lay out the framework for how like an octopus mind could look, and how through these like differences in evolution, it's a possibility that other forms of mind can exist that we would not necessarily be able to comprehend. But I think through Godfrey Smith's like whole book, like I'm able to comprehend it now. I don't think I'll ever understand like how it functions or works, because I have my own implicit human bias on how cognition works based on what I understand about my own being. But I now can understand that there are other ways that a mind can come to be, and they can look a lot different from how my mind works. And it's not really anyone's place to understand how it works. I think it's more so just about recognizing and acknowledging that other minds can exist. And just because it's different from ours doesn't necessarily mean it's not as important. And yeah, that was it. Thanks for tuning in. Go Canes. See y'all on Tuesday.